The people of the Blue Ridge Hills said the woman arrived before memory learned how to keep count. She was simply there, like the fog that rolled low through the hollows at dawn, like the old roads that bent where they pleased and never apologized for it. They called her a midwife, though the word never felt large enough for what she did or what she left behind. She came when the screams began and the lanterns were lit in the windows, when the men stood helpless in the yard and the women prayed with clenched teeth. She came with her bag of clean cloth and rust-smelling tools, her fingers always warm no matter the season, her eyes dark and steady as deep water. Children lived because of her. That was the truth no one could deny. Pink and breathing, slick with blood and promise, they entered the world beneath her hands. Mothers whispered her name with gratitude long after the umbilical cords were buried near the roots of apple trees. In a place where winter could seal a family inside its own grave and sickness traveled faster than help, she was a miracle that walked on 2 feet. But the hills have a way of keeping score. It started with nails. Not the kind driven into wood, but the kind clipped and trimmed, gathered carefully and wrapped in cloth instead of discarded. Some women noticed she never let them keep the parings. Some men swore their fingers ached days after she shook their hands. Livestock sickened near certain homes, and iron rusted faster where it shouldn't. When death came, it came politely, slipping into beds at night, stopping hearts without a sound. Folks said it was the mountain air, or bad luck, or God collecting what was owed. The midwife never attended funerals. She passed houses where the dead lay cooling and did not look back. Her shadow stretched long at dusk, thin as a nail itself, and when she walked the ridges the crows followed at a distance, quiet and waiting. Children born under her care sometimes grew with a strange stillness in them, as if listening for something the rest of the world could not hear. And beneath the soil of the Blue Ridge Hills, iron slept beside bone, paid for in silence, patience, and blood that never truly washed away. Before the hills learned her name, they learned her necessity. The Blue Ridge settlements were stitched together by dirt roads that vanished in rain and winter, and doctors from the lowlands rarely climbed high enough to risk their horses or their reputations. When labor came early or late, when a woman screamed through the night while men waited uselessly outside, there was no bell to ring, no help to summon except the one figure who always arrived. She came on foot or by mule, through snow that swallowed fences and fog that erased distance, carrying a bag that smelled of iron, herbs, and clean cloth. No one remembered inviting her the first time. She simply appeared when life demanded passage into the world. She knew the language of bodies the way the hills knew weather. Her hands moved without hesitation, pressing, turning, coaxing breath into blue lips. She spoke little, but when she did, women obeyed without knowing why. Pain loosened beneath her voice. Panic receded. Babies arrived alive who should not have survived the night, and mothers lived through labors that should have killed them. Word spread across ridges and hollows, from cabins crouched in laurel thickets to farmhouses clinging to steep slopes. If she was present, death kept its distance. If she could not be found, graves were dug too small. Gratitude hardened into reverence. Families named children after her, or at least with her blessing. She was fed before pastors, sheltered before kin. Her fee was modest and strange, often paid in eggs, cloth, or silence rather than money. She never haggled. She never stayed long after the crying stopped. By morning she was gone, leaving behind a cleaned room, a living child, and a sense that something older than kindness had passed through the house. Years folded over themselves, and still she came. Wrinkles deepened on everyone else's faces while hers remained unchanged, neither young nor old, fixed in a narrow band of time. Mothers who had once been delivered by her watched her lift their daughters onto beds and perform the same careful rituals without pause or fatigue. In communities that feared outsiders and distrusted change, she became the exception, the one constant no one questioned. To doubt her was to doubt the survival of the next generation. Trust settled so deeply that warning signs dissolved before they could take shape. When illness followed her visits, people blamed the mountain damp or bad water. When men died not long after a birth, grief bent toward coincidence instead of suspicion. After all, she had brought life into the world with those same hands. The hills had no room for the idea that the giver of breath could also be the courier of its end, and so her footsteps continued unchallenged along the ridges, welcomed into every home, into every hour where hope and fear shared the same bed, and the people believed that whatever she carried in her bag was meant only to help them live. The first whispers did not name her, and that was how they survived. They floated through kitchens and across fence lines as vague unease, as patterns no one wanted to assemble. A man would take ill a week after his wife gave birth, his skin turning grey, his strength leaving him in quiet increments. An elder who had blessed the newborn would complain of aching fingers and a metallic taste in the mouth before failing in his sleep. The deaths were unremarkable on their own, common enough in the hills where hard lives wore bodies thin, but timing has a way of sharpening grief into suspicion. People noticed how often death followed her departure like a delayed echo. Not immediately, never dramatic, but close enough to make memory itch. A husband buried in early spring. A grandmother gone by summer's end. The midwife's visits were counted backward from funerals instead of forward from births. Still, no one spoke openly. Gratitude outweighed doubt, and fear of losing her services pressed heavier than fear of unanswered questions. In a place where childbirth could kill as easily as it could bless, people chose the certainty of life over the discomfort of patterns they could not explain. Doctors, when they came at all, called the deaths natural. Heart failure. Infection. Age catching up at last. Paperwork soothed nerves, and the language of authority wrapped the community in excuses that felt safer than truth. Even so, some women began to wash their floors twice after the midwife left. Some men avoided shaking her hand. A few mothers hid nail clippings before she could gather them, though they could never explain why their fingers trembled as they did. The rumors grew teeth when two men from neighboring ridges died within days of each other, both having mocked the midwife's strange habits during separate births. One had laughed when she asked for quiet, the other when she asked to be paid in iron instead of coin. Their deaths were slow and humiliating, marked by swelling hands, blackened veins, and a rot that seemed to start beneath the skin. The hills watched closely then, waiting for lightning to strike again in a place where it should not. Yet reverence does not break easily. Each new birth rewrote memory. Each crying infant pushed doubt back into the dark. Those who questioned her found themselves isolated, accused of ingratitude or superstition. What kind of person turns on the woman who saved their child? What kind of community survives without her? The midwife herself offered nothing to feed or starve the rumors. She did not defend her name or deny the whispers. She continued her work with the same calm precision, walking out of homes where joy still clung to the walls, leaving behind lives that would grow up believing she was a blessing, even as the hills quietly began to count the dead who followed in her wake. He came through the Blue Ridge Hills with a borrowed mule and a Bible worn soft as cloth, calling himself a traveling preacher because no other name fit the way he moved. He stayed only long enough in each place to feel the shape of its sins, long enough to notice what others stepped around without seeing. Unlike the locals, he had no history to protect, no gratitude anchoring his judgment, and when he listened to their stories he heard a rhythm beneath the words that unsettled him. Births followed by funerals. Blessings shadowed by rot. A woman spoken of with reverence and unease in equal measure. He first noticed the iron outside a cabin where a child had been born the night before. Beneath the front step, half buried in mud, were filings of rust and tiny bent nails driven into the earth in deliberate patterns. They were not placed for construction or repair, and they were too fresh to be remnants of old work. When he asked the family about them, they shrugged and said the hills were full of strange things. Still, he returned after the midwife left another home and found the same signs, hidden just enough to avoid notice but too careful to be accidental. The preacher began to look for them everywhere she went. At doorways, beneath beds, under windowsills where infants slept. Iron was wedged into cracks and pressed into soil, often smeared with something dark that flaked away under his fingers. He recognized the symbols scratched nearby, not from scripture but from older warnings, fragments of folk belief he had encountered in forgotten places. Binding marks. Balance marks. The kind meant to hold something in place or keep something from crossing a threshold. When deaths followed, he returned to those homes and found the iron still there, deeper now, driven further into wood and ground as if time itself were hammering it down. He prayed over one such house and felt no answer come back to him, only a pressure like breath held too long. His sermons shifted. He spoke of false saviors and gifts that demanded payment, though he never named the midwife. The people listened politely and changed nothing. One evening he waited near a birth cabin after dark and watched her kneel by the door once she thought herself alone. From her bag she drew thin nails, blackened and sharp as thorns, and pressed them into the dirt with bare fingers. There was no hesitation, no pain in her face. The preacher stepped forward then, demanding to know what covenant she served. She looked at him with mild curiosity, as if he were a child asking the wrong question, and told him the hills had always required iron to remember their bargains. The next morning the filings were gone, and so was he, his mule found wandering without him, its hooves stained red with mountain clay, and the people said he had simply moved on, though the iron beneath their steps remained, silent and waiting. The young mother had endured a labor that seemed determined to break her, hours stretching into a night where the candles burned low and the walls sweated with heat and fear. When the midwife arrived, the room shifted, as it always did, panic loosening its grip as those steady hands took command. The child was born alive, small but breathing, and the relief that followed felt like mercy itself. The mother wept and thanked her until her voice gave out, believing she had been spared something unspeakable. In the days that followed, the baby seemed healthy enough. He cried with strength, fed eagerly, and slept curled against his mother's chest. The midwife returned once, claiming to check the child's progress, her gaze lingering longer than necessary on the infant's fingers and toes. She said nails grew strangely fast in some children and should be trimmed before they caught on cloth. The mother hesitated, uneasy without knowing why, but she had been taught to trust. She handed over the child. The clipping was quick and precise. The midwife used a small, dark tool that never left her hand, catching each sliver of nail in a folded cloth. She spoke softly while she worked, words the mother could not quite hear, words that seemed meant for the child alone. When she finished, she tucked the cloth into her bag and left without accepting payment, which felt stranger than any request she might have made. That night, the baby cried in a way that was different from hunger or cold. His cries were thin, strained, as if pulled through something tight. His fingers reddened, then darkened at the edges, the skin around the nails swelling and shining. By morning, his appetite had faded. The mother tried to nurse him, to warm him, to soothe him with every remedy she knew, but his body felt wrong against hers, too still between the cries. Neighbors came and whispered explanations that did nothing to help. Bad milk. Evil air. A chill caught too young. No one mentioned the midwife, though her name hovered in the room like smoke. When the child worsened, the mother sent someone to fetch her, but she did not come. Days passed, and the baby weakened, his hands curling inward as if grasping for something unseen. In desperation, the mother unwrapped the cloth left behind by the midwife, forgotten at the bottom of the cradle. Inside were the nail clippings, blackened and fused together with a sticky residue that smelled faintly of iron. Panic broke through the fog of grief then, sharp and undeniable. She buried the clippings in the yard, but the soil around them soured and turned dark. The child lived, barely, long enough to survive, but he never truly recovered. His fingers remained stiff, his nails thick and discolored, and as he grew he would flinch whenever iron was near, crying out before he could explain why, while his mother learned to fear the smallest things she had once believed harmless. The hillside cemetery had always been uneven, graves cut where the rock allowed and crooked stones leaning like tired men, but no one remembered it ever looking restless. After the rumors hardened into something heavier, people began to notice small changes that could not be blamed on rain or animals. Soil around certain plots sank inward, leaving shallow depressions as if the ground were breathing out. Fresh earth appeared where no one had dug. Stones shifted their positions overnight, turning slightly toward the valley as though listening. The first to speak openly was an old man who had buried two sons within a year of each other, both of whom had been present at different births attended by the midwife. He swore he heard metal striking wood late one night, a dull tapping that came from beneath the earth rather than above it. When others laughed him off, he returned with proof. At dawn, he showed them the disturbed grave of his eldest, the soil pulled back just enough to reveal splintered coffin planks and something dark driven straight through the lid. Once eyes were opened, the signs multiplied. Graves connected to her visits bore the same wounds, iron objects hammered down into the dead as if to pin them in place. Some nails were thick and crude, others thin and precise, sunk deep into bone. There were scratches carved along coffin edges, symbols half erased by decay but still legible enough to unsettle those who recognized fragments of old mountain lore. These were not acts of grief or madness, but of intention. Families argued over whether to rebury the disturbed dead or leave them untouched. Fear crept into mourning, tainting prayers with uncertainty. If the graves were opened, what else might rise with the truth? If they were left alone, what bargain had already been sealed beneath the soil? The midwife continued to walk the hills during this time, passing the cemetery without a glance, her footsteps never slowing, her shadow never crossing the fence line. One night, a group of men gathered with shovels and lanterns, determined to exhume a grave completely and end the speculation. They uncovered a coffin belonging to a woman who had died peacefully weeks after a successful birth. Inside, her hands were folded as they should have been, but iron nails pierced each finger, driven through nail beds and bone alike, rust blooming outward into the flesh. The sight scattered them, grown men stumbling back from the pit as if the earth itself had struck them. By morning, word had spread beyond whispers. The cemetery was no longer sacred ground but a ledger of debts paid in iron. Mothers pulled their children closer when passing the graves, and elders avoided the place entirely. Yet even then, no one confronted the midwife. The dead were silent, the living afraid, and the hills held their secrets tightly, iron locked beneath soil and memory, waiting for the moment when balance would demand more than fear could contain. The blacksmith had kept quiet longer than most, not out of loyalty but out of habit. His forge sat at the edge of the valley where the road narrowed and strangers rarely bothered to travel, and for years he had learned that survival in the hills depended on knowing when not to speak. When the iron in the graves was uncovered and men began to whisper his name alongside the midwife's, he tried to deny it, but memory does not bend easily once it is called. She had come to him at dusk the first time, standing in the doorway while sparks leapt from the anvil and settled like dying stars at her feet. She did not greet him the way others did. She asked if he could make nails thinner than any he had ever forged, long as needles, sharp enough to pierce without splitting wood. He laughed at first, thinking it a joke, until he saw the seriousness in her eyes. She placed a bundle of herbs on his workbench, rare things dried and bound with twine, plants his mother had once sworn could draw fever out of the blood. Payment was never discussed in coin. She asked instead for discretion, and something in her tone told him it was not a request. He worked late into the night, heating iron until it glowed white, drawing it out carefully so it would not snap. The nails were wrong somehow, too precise, too deliberate, as if they were meant for flesh rather than timber. When he handed them to her, she weighed them in her palm, nodded once, and vanished back into the hills. She returned many times after that. Sometimes she asked for thicker spikes, sometimes for filings swept from the forge floor, sometimes for nothing more than a handful of rust scraped from old tools. Each time she paid in herbs, or in silence about things the blacksmith did not want known. Once, after his wife fell ill and recovered too quickly to be believed, he understood what kind of currency she truly dealt in. As the graves were disturbed and fear turned outward, the blacksmith began to feel the weight of every nail he had ever shaped for her. He dreamed of hammering endlessly, iron stretching and screaming beneath his blows while hands reached up from the earth to claim what he had made. When questioned, he finally spoke, his voice breaking as he described her orders and the way she always knew exactly how many nails she needed before asking. He told them she never explained their purpose, only that iron remembered better than flesh, and that some doors could not be kept closed without pain. When they asked why he continued helping her, he had no answer that satisfied even himself. He had been afraid, yes, but more than that, he had believed her when she said the hills demanded balance, and that refusal would only shift the cost onto someone weaker. By the time his confession spread through the valley, the forge had gone cold, the anvil silent, and the blacksmith sat alone with hands that would never again feel clean, knowing the iron he had shaped was still buried out there, holding down truths that were beginning to push back up through the soil. The blacksmith had lived at the edge of the ridge for most of his life, close enough to the road to hear travelers before he saw them, far enough from the rest of the settlement to keep his own counsel. He was a practical man who believed iron did what it was told if it was heated, shaped, and cooled correctly. When the midwife first came to him, he thought nothing of her request. She asked for nails, but not the kind meant for barns or coffins. These were thin, tapered, longer than they should have been, sharp enough to draw blood if mishandled. She paid him with dried herbs and a promise that his forge would never fail him, which he laughed at and accepted anyway. Over time, her requests grew stranger. She wanted iron worked cold, then reheated just enough to darken without softening. She wanted filings collected and wrapped carefully instead of swept away. She never asked for large quantities, only a handful at a time, but she returned often, always at dusk, always alone. The blacksmith noticed that the metal behaved differently for her. Nails quenched for her hissed louder, cooled faster, and rusted almost immediately, as if eager to change. He began to remember each transaction when the rumors reached his door. Deaths following births. Iron found where it did not belong. He counted the nails he had made for her and lost track somewhere around the number of graves in the hillside cemetery. Guilt settled into him like ash, coating everything. He considered refusing her, but the thought of denying her made his hands ache and his forge burn unevenly. The last time she came, he tried to ask what the nails were for. She looked at him with something close to pity and told him iron remembered touch better than flesh ever could. That life left traces, and death needed something solid to hold it in place. When she left, the forge went cold behind her, and it did not light again for days. The blacksmith took this as a warning. He gathered what iron he had left, buried it deep in the ground, and told himself silence was safer than truth, even as he realized how deeply he had already helped shape whatever walked the hills in her shadow. The child grew slowly, not in body but in awareness, as though his senses were tuned to something just beneath the ordinary world. He had been born under the midwife's hands, one of many, but something about him lingered with her longer than it should have. As he aged, he complained of whispers that came from the ground, faint and persistent, guiding him when he tried to sleep. His parents dismissed it as imagination, mountain superstition passed down like bad weather, but the child learned to follow the voices anyway. They led him to places no one else visited willingly. Old burial sites half swallowed by brush. Abandoned cabins where the floors sagged and iron nails bled rust into the wood. He found spots in the earth where his skin prickled and his teeth hurt, where the whispers grew clearer, urging him to dig. When he did, he uncovered fragments of metal driven into soil and bone, arranged with care and purpose. He did not understand what he was seeing, only that it felt familiar, like something he had always known. As he grew older, the whispers began to form words. They spoke of balance, of debts paid and owed, of life crossing into the world and needing an anchor on the other side. He dreamed of hands trimming his nails again and again, felt phantom pressure at his fingertips, and woke with his fingers curled tight into his palms. Iron made him sick. The smell of it turned his stomach, yet he was drawn to it, compelled to find where it slept beneath the hills. The midwife watched him from a distance as he grew, her expression unreadable. She never approached him, never spoke his name, but the whispers sharpened whenever she passed nearby. He began to understand that he was connected to the hidden ledger buried in the ground, that his birth had been marked differently. The hills had chosen him as a listener, a witness to what had been sealed away. By the time he was old enough to understand fear, he knew too much to escape it. The whispers told him where bodies lay pinned by iron, where bargains had been struck and sealed, and they promised that one day he would be asked to help keep the balance himself, whether he wanted to or not. The blacksmith had lived his whole life by sound and heat, by the honest ring of hammer on anvil and the predictable obedience of iron. He knew when metal was wrong. When the midwife first came to him, she did not ask for horseshoes or hinges, but for nails unlike any he had ever been taught to make. Thin as needles, long enough to bite deep, flattened just enough at the head to be driven without bending. She asked for them and tempered, brittle in a way that felt dangerous. When he questioned her, she told him they were for delicate work, for things that must not move once set. She paid him in bundles of dried herbs and a pouch of bone dust, items that unsettled him more than coin ever could. Over time, she returned again and again, always with the same calm expression, always requesting the same nails. He noticed her hands never blistered when she touched freshly forged metal. He noticed she never aged, though his own hair thinned and grayed. The unease grew slowly, like rust creeping beneath paint. After the graves were found disturbed, the blacksmith's memory sharpened into dread. He remembered the exact weight of the iron she preferred, the way she insisted on working alone while collecting her order, the way she pressed one nail into the dirt outside his forge before leaving, as if sealing something behind her. When questioned by neighbors, he tried to deny his part, but guilt cracked him open. He confessed in pieces, voice breaking as he admitted how many he had made, how long it had gone on, how she had always known exactly how many she needed. The community turned on him with a fury born of fear. He was accused of helping her, of feeding whatever sickness had taken hold of the hills. He swore he did not know what the nails were for, only that iron obeys those who understand it, and she understood it too well. Before they could decide what to do with him, his forge burned in the night, flames devouring tools that had shaped generations of honest work. In the ashes, they found one of her nails, unburnt, cold, and clean, as if it had never been touched by fire, and the blacksmith fled the hills before dawn, carrying with him the knowledge that iron remembers every hand that shapes it. The child was born during a storm that rattled the valley, thunder rolling so close it felt like the mountains were cracking open. He came into the world silent, eyes wide and unblinking, until the midwife pressed 2 fingers to his chest and whispered something that made him scream. As he grew, it became clear he was different in ways that unsettled even his parents. He rarely slept, rarely cried, and often stared at corners of rooms as if someone stood there just beyond sight. When iron was near, he reacted before anyone else noticed it, flinching, reaching, sometimes smiling in a way that felt wrong for a child. By the time he could walk, he wandered the hills alone, drawn toward places others avoided. He led his mother once to a patch of ground where the soil was darker, softer, and beneath it they found the edge of a disturbed grave. He could not explain how he knew it was there. He only said the ground was loud. As he grew older, the whispers grew clearer, guiding him to hidden burial sites, to nails driven into roots and stones, to places where the hills had been wounded and patched over. The midwife watched him from a distance, her gaze lingering longer than it ever had on any other child. She never touched him again after his birth, never trimmed his nails, never crossed his path directly. Others began to fear him, calling him cursed, saying he carried death in his ears. Yet he spoke of balance, of things buried that wanted to be counted. At night, he dreamed of iron sinking into flesh, of hands reaching up from soil, of bargains made before anyone living had been born. When he finally spoke against her, telling the people what the whispers had shown him, they did not know whether to believe him or silence him. He carried proof in the form of maps scratched into wood, symbols that matched those found on coffins and doorsteps. The hills had chosen him as a witness, and witnesses are rarely spared, especially when they threaten to name the thing everyone fears but depends upon. Decades passed, and still the midwife walked the ridges with the same measured steps, her face unchanged while the world around her softened and sagged with time. Children she had delivered grew old and died, their grandchildren taking their places, yet she remained fixed, untouched by years or hardship. At first, people told themselves she aged well, that mountain life preserved her, but denial froze when stretched too thin. Lines deepened on every face but hers. Hair silvered, backs bent, hands shook, while she remained as she always had, neither young nor old, suspended in a moment that refused to pass. Records were searched, family Bibles opened, memories compared. Her name appeared in births separated by 50, 60 years, written in the same careful hand. Some claimed their great-grandmothers had spoken of her with the same voice of gratitude and fear. The realization spread slowly, like cold seeping through walls. She had not inherited the work. She had always been the work. The hills themselves seemed to acknowledge her permanence. Paths cleared where she walked most often. Animals fell silent when she passed. Storms broke around her rather than over her. People began to understand that she was not simply living alongside them, but anchored to the land in a way none of them were. She did not belong to time as they did. Time belonged to her. Attempts were made to drive her away, subtle at first, then bolder. Doors closed when she approached. Lanterns went unlit. Yet when labor came hard and blood soaked the floorboards, fear overcame resolve. They called for her again, and she came, unchanged, unchallenged, her presence both salvation and threat. The hills demanded her, and she demanded her price, and as long as children were born and death waited nearby, the balance held, uneasy and unbroken. The winter had been cruel, a bitter season that left the hills slick with ice and the hollows silent except for the occasional snap of a branch under snow's weight. After the storms receded, a landslide revealed what no one had expected to see: a cabin hidden in a remote hollow, long buried under years of rock and mud. The timbers were splintered, the roof collapsed in jagged angles, and the walls were blackened by water and rot. Yet inside, in the dim space between shattered beams, there was a collection that made even the most hardened villagers stagger back in disbelief. Jars lined shelves along the walls, filled with brittle clippings of fingernails that varied in size and color, some yellowed with age, others blackened as if charred. Each jar had a label, written in a precise hand, recording dates and the names of children and parents who had passed under her care. Among the jars were rust-stained tools, delicate and cruel in design, some no longer than a finger, others sharp enough to pierce flesh or bone. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but the unmistakable smell of iron lingered in the air, mingling with the mildew of the collapsed cabin. Papers were stacked in corners, birth records marked with strange symbols that twisted familiar letters into patterns that seemed to crawl across the page. The handwriting was meticulous, obsessive, a ledger of life and death that had gone unnoticed in plain sight for decades. Anyone who dared to read them felt unease coil in their stomachs as if the words themselves were heavy, pulling at something deep inside. The walls bore more than shelves, they carried evidence of her presence. Spent candles had burned into carved circles on the wooden beams, and faint streaks of rust-colored residue traced the edges of the floorboards. These were not accidents, nor were they left for show. The cabin was a record, a shrine to a practice so precise that it demanded secrecy, and yet so vast that it could not remain hidden forever. Even the smallest nails were catalogued, each one a fragment of what she had touched, each clipping a silent witness to the bargains she had struck. As villagers explored the space, they realized with a cold certainty that life and death had always been intertwined in her hands. Every birth she attended, every child she delivered, had come with a price that was now recorded in meticulous detail. There was no malice in the records, no confessions, only facts written as if she were the mountains themselves, indifferent to the lives and deaths she had orchestrated. The cabin spoke for her, even in her absence, revealing the full extent of what had been hidden behind her calm face, her warm hands, and the quiet footsteps that had traversed the hills for generations. By the time the truth began to surface, it was already too late for many to turn back. The people of the Blue Ridge Hills had long accepted her as a giver of life, a healer who arrived when hope seemed thin and fragile. They had watched her hands coax newborns into the world, steady and sure, and believed that each child carried a blessing that outweighed any shadow. But the cabin unearthed by the winter landslide, with its jars of fingernails, rusted tools, and meticulous records, forced a reckoning that had been waiting beneath the soil and the fog all along. Life and death were not separate under her care, they were two halves of a ledger she alone could balance. Each birth required a payment, and the hills had been keeping score without realizing it. The villagers began to piece together the evidence, connecting illnesses, sudden deaths, and the disturbing disturbances in the cemetery to the midwife's presence. Her hands had delivered life, yes, but they had also orchestrated an equal measure of death, precise and deliberate, like iron hammered into wood or bone. Every child who cried in the morning had entered the world with a secret price. Every surviving mother owed a debt no ledger could quantify. People tried to reconcile this with the gratitude that had built her reputation for decades, but the realization cut deeper than any winter frost. The woman they had trusted to carry life had woven death into the very fabric of it. Some families attempted to confront her, to demand answers or to refuse her services going forward, but she moved with a patience that outlasted fear and argument. Her eyes held no shame, her voice offered no apology. She treated those who questioned her with the same calm exactitude she showed to the families who welcomed her. The mountain itself seemed to conspire with her, hiding the evidence in plain sight and letting the living accept what they could, or else be consumed by what they could not. The midwife's influence stretched beyond the cabins, beyond the graves, into every ridge and hollow where she had walked, leaving a trail of quiet terror carefully balanced by the life she had given. Children born under her care carried the weight of this unseen economy. Some grew with strange sensitivities, flinching at iron or whispering to shadows that others could not hear. Adults, too, found themselves looking at every birth and every death with a new wariness, unable to unlearn the connection between the two. Life itself had become inseparable from her design, an arrangement written into the hills and recorded in the jars that had surfaced like relics of some impossible ritual. Those who survived her touch could only navigate the world cautiously, aware that every breath she had helped deliver had been matched by a measure of her calculating hand, and that the balance she demanded was relentless, precise, and eternal.